On the island of Crete, in the southern Aegean, where limestone mountains fall steeply into the sea and olive groves cover the lower slopes, the ruins of palaces have stood for 35 centuries. The textbook will tell you these were the work of the first great civilization of Europe, a brilliant Bronze Age culture, the builders of Knossos, the painters of dolphins and bull leapers, the people who supposedly seeded Greek civilization itself. For more than 100 years, that was the story, Europe's first masterpiece. Then ancient DNA was extracted from Minoan bones, sealed in burial caves and hillside tombs. When the results came back, the foundation of the textbook story collapsed. The Minoans were never who Europe claimed them to be, and the bloodline that built Knossos did not vanish in the Bronze Age. It has been walking the same island the entire time, hiding in plain sight. To understand what the DNA overturned, you have to first understand what the DNA was overturning. And that means going back to a civilization that for the better part of 1,000 years was the most sophisticated thing happening anywhere in the Aegean. Crete sits in the southern reaches of that sea, 160 miles long, one of the largest islands in the Mediterranean. People had been farming there since at least 7,000 years before Christ. Then around 3000 BC, something changed. The villages began to grow, the countryside filled with farms and shepherds' compounds. By 1900 BC, the town of Knossos held an estimated 17,000 people. By the height of the palace period, perhaps 40,000. They built great palaces, more than half a dozen of them. Multi-story complexes with banquet halls, ceremonial courtyards, ashlar masonry borrowed from Egyptian royal architecture, drainage systems, raised walkways, fresco-covered walls. They painted dolphins and octopuses and women in flounced skirts. They leapt over bulls in scenes that have never been fully explained. They worshipped goddesses with snakes coiled along their arms. They wrote in 2 scripts that no one has ever read. They shipped their distinctive vases across the eastern Mediterranean, and Minoan pottery has been found at Byblos, at Beirut, at Ugarit. And then in 1900 AD, an Englishman arrived. His name was Arthur Evans. He bought the hill at Knossos, began excavating, and within a few years was telling the world he had found the cradle of European civilization. He named the people after the mythical king Minos. He reconstructed the palace walls in painted concrete. He pieced the frescoes back together according to his own preferences. And he gave the world a story it was eager to hear. Europe's first sophisticated ancestors, the mother culture that stood behind classical Greece, a peaceful, artistic, sea-loving people from whom the Western tradition descended. The story hardened into orthodoxy across the 20th century. Museum displays repeated it. School textbooks repeated it. Popular histories repeated it. The Minoans as the first Europeans, the foundation stone of the West. The problem is that nearly every part of that story was built before anyone could read the bones. Before ancient DNA analysis existed, before genome-wide sequencing existed, before anyone had pulled genetic material from a Cretan skeleton and compared it against the populations of 3 continents. The textbook version was constructed from frescoes, from architecture, from a great deal of wishful thinking, and from the personal preoccupations of a single Edwardian archaeologist who had decided what he wanted to find before he found it. The bones themselves sat in their caves, unread, for a century. Ancient DNA analysis is exactly what it sounds like. Scientists extract genetic material from skeletal remains that have been in the ground for thousands of years, sequence it against modern genomes, and build a detailed biological portrait of who those people were, where they came from, and how they relate to populations still living today. It is in every meaningful sense a time machine made of bone. For most of the 20th century, this was not possible. The technology did not exist. The Minoans were studied with frescoes and potsherds and the reconstructions of an Edwardian archaeologist working from his own preconceptions. The bones themselves, sealed in their burial caves and rock-cut tombs across Crete, sat in museum drawers largely unread. Then in the 2010s, ancient DNA sequencing reached the level of precision that allowed researchers to extract readable genetic material from Bronze Age Cretan skeletons. The breakthrough study was published in Nature in 2017, building on work that had traced ancient genomes across Crete, mainland Greece, and southwestern Anatolia. The question driving the research was simple: where had the Minoans actually come from? Earlier mitochondrial work had hinted at links to populations in Western and Northern Europe, which would have aligned neatly with the Evans framing. Europe's first Europeans descended from a European stock. Then the genome-wide results came in. The Minoans were not a population that had drifted south from Europe. Their genetic profile pointed unambiguously to the east. Roughly 3/4 of their ancestry traced to the early Neolithic farmers of Anatolia and the Levant, the same farming populations that had spread agriculture across the Near East 9,000 years earlier. The remainder traced to populations from the Caucasus and Iran, carrying signatures that had moved westward across Anatolia in the millennia that followed. There was no European founder stock. There was no signal of a population that had developed in isolation on a remote island. The people who built Knossos, who painted the dolphins, who wrote in Linear A, who shipped vases from Crete to Ugarit, were not a European population. They were a Near Eastern population that had crossed the Aegean during the Neolithic expansion and settled an island that became, over thousands of years, the platform for one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the Bronze Age. The textbook had described Europe's first masterpiece. The DNA described a Near Eastern population sitting on a European island. Arthur Evans had not discovered the cradle of European civilization. He had discovered the westernmost edge of a Near Eastern world that had been moving across the Aegean for thousands of years before the first stone of Knossos was laid. And the question that followed was the one Evans had never been in a position to ask. If the Minoans were not European, who exactly were they, and were they really gone? Once the genetic trail pointed east, the rest of the evidence began to fall into place. The earliest human inhabitants of Crete, dated to at least 7,000 BC, were farmers. They lived in small villages along the coast and on the fertile Massara plain. They grew wheat and barley. They brought with them the Anatolian mountain goat, the ancestor of the Cretan wild goat. The genome-wide studies showed they shared a founder group with the Greeks of the mainland, one whose origins lay in Anatolia and the Levant. The DNA was not telling a new story. It was confirming what the soil and the seeds had been saying for decades. Then came the cultural fingerprints. The pottery styles of early Crete had Anatolian roots. The burial practices that appeared along the coastline around 2100 BC included Cycladic cyst graves, Anatolian pythos burials, and Egyptian-style coffins called larnakes. New waves of migrants were arriving from across the eastern Mediterranean, depositing their funerary traditions directly into the Cretan record. Then came the architecture. The ashlar masonry of the great palaces, the precisely cut stone facing that gave Knossos and Phaistos their grandeur, was taken directly from Egyptian royal building traditions. The administrative systems, the seal-based bureaucracies, the centralized storage and redistribution of agricultural goods were all borrowed from Mesopotamia and the Levant. Then came the gods. The horns of consecration that sat on the rooftops of every Minoan sanctuary, the symbol most often used to mark a sacred space across the island, traced their origin to an Egyptian and Mesopotamian icon representing the twin peaks of a holy mountain. The Minoan practice of worshipping at peak sanctuaries, placing shrines on the highest mountain visible from each valley, mirrored the Eastern belief that the gods met on mountaintops. The famous snake goddesses found at Knossos, the bare-breasted figures in tight corsets with serpents coiled along their arms, displayed iconography that historians have noted shows significant Syrian influence. The local elites at Knossos were drawing directly from Near Eastern religious models to enhance their own status. Then came the trade. Copper, lead, silver, gold, and tin, the metals that built the Bronze Age, flowed into Crete from Assyria, Egypt, and the Levant. Minoan vases moved in the other direction, found at Byblos, Beirut, and Ugarit. Egyptian motifs were borrowed for amulets and seals. Three independent lines of evidence pointed in the same direction: genetic, architectural, religious. The Minoans were not a European population that had developed in isolation on a remote island. They were a Near Eastern population that had carried its language, its gods, its building traditions, and its bureaucratic systems with it across the Aegean during the Neolithic, then synthesized those imported traditions over thousands of years into something genuinely original. The originality was real. The European pedigree was not. The labyrinth at Knossos was not built by Europeans. It was built by people whose ancestors had walked out of Anatolia. Around 1600 BC, the Minoan world was struck by a catastrophe it had no way of preparing for. The volcano on the island of Thera, 70 miles to the north, erupted in one of the largest volcanic events in human history. Earthquakes and tsunamis battered the northern coast of Crete. 5 to 15 centimeters of silica-rich and fluoride-rich ash drifted across the island, killing crops and animals, poisoning the water sources, inducing acute famine. Thousands of Minoans died. Settlements were abandoned or rebuilt on a smaller scale. The trade networks that had carried Minoan vases to the Levant began to falter. Minoan culture endured, but as a lesser version of itself, smaller in scale, smaller in wealth. Into this vacuum stepped a power that had been untouched by the eruption. The Mycenaean Greeks of the mainland had developed their own warrior elite culture with chariots, weaponry, and a militaristic burial tradition entirely unlike anything on Crete. Around 1450 BC, the palaces across Crete burned. Phaistos fell. Malea fell. The grand townhouses of Knossos were leveled. Knossos itself endured, but reduced. Rough stone walls patched the surviving rooms. The splendor was gone. The administrative language at the palace changed. The earlier script of Linear A vanished from the record. In its place came Linear B, the script that the English linguist Michael Ventris would finally decipher in 1952. Linear B was an early form of Greek. The names of Greek deities began to appear in the tablets: Poseidon, Zeus. The burial practices changed too. The new graves filled with weapons and armor, with drinking equipment and grooming tools. The warrior burials of a militaristic culture in a land that had previously buried its dead with frescoes and seals. The Mycenaeans had taken over. They did not exterminate the Minoans. They politically dominated them. The Minoan population continued to live on the island beneath a Mycenaean ruling elite, speaking a language that would gradually be replaced, worshipping gods that would gradually be absorbed into the Greek pantheon. The artistic style endured for a time. The marine-style pottery, the dynamic depictions of octopuses and dolphins wrapping around the surface of every vase, reached its peak just before the palaces fell. Minoan votive offerings continued at peak sanctuaries and sacred caves. Traditional Minoan cemeteries remained in use for generations. Then the late Bronze Age collapse arrived in the 12th century BC. The climate cooled. Drought spread across the eastern Mediterranean. The sea peoples raided coastlines from Anatolia to Egypt. The Mycenaean palatial system collapsed across the Aegean, dragging Crete down with it. The Greek Dark Age began. By the early 11th century BC, the Minoans appeared to have vanished altogether. Their language gone, their palaces empty, their gods absorbed, their identity dissolved into the wider Greek world. That has been the textbook ending for 3,000 years. And like the European framing, it has been wrong. The discovery that overturned the vanishing narrative came from the same source that had overturned the European framing: ancient DNA. In 2013, a team of researchers led by the geneticist George Stamatoianopoulos published a study in Nature Communications. They had extracted mitochondrial DNA from Minoan skeletal remains found in burial caves on the Lassithi Plateau, a high upland basin in central eastern Crete, sitting more than 1,000 meters above sea level. They sequenced the ancient samples. Then they compared them to the modern population living on the same plateau today. The closest living genetic match to the Bronze Age Minoans was found among the present-day villagers of Lassithae itself, not in mainland Greece, not in Italy, not scattered across Europe, in the same highland villages that sit above the same caves where the Bronze Age bones had been buried. The descendants of the people who built Knossos were not lost. They were not absorbed beyond recognition. They were not scattered across the Mediterranean by the late Bronze Age collapse. They had retreated into the mountains when the lowlands fell, settled in highland villages, farmed the same upland soils for 3,000 years, and carried in their bodies the same maternal lineages that had been deposited in the burial caves of their Bronze Age ancestors. The broader picture confirmed it. The 2017 genome-wide study found that the modern Cretan population descends in large part from the same Bronze Age substrate that produced the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. The Minoan signal had not been erased. It had been folded into the population that still walks the island. The cultural continuity had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Minoan-style votive offerings persisted at sacred caves and urban shrines well into the post-palatial period. Traditional Minoan cemeteries remained in use for generations after the palaces fell. Minoan religious figures were absorbed directly into the Greek pantheon. The goddess Artemis carries the marks of a Minoan ancestor. The classical tradition of mountain nymphs traces back to Cretan peak sanctuaries. Herodotus recorded that the Spartans themselves believed their council of elders, the Gerousia, had originated on Crete. The collapse of the Minoan palatial system was not the disappearance of a people. It was a political and cultural transformation that left the population itself in place. The textbook narrative had treated the end of the palaces as the end of the Minoans. The DNA showed otherwise. The bloodline that built Knossos retreated into the mountains, weathered the Dark Age, lived through the Iron Age, the Classical period, the Roman conquest, the Byzantine centuries, the Venetian occupation, the Ottoman rule, and emerged into the modern era still rooted in the same upland villages above the same plateau where their Bronze Age ancestors had buried their dead. The Minoans were never lost. They were never even hidden. They were exactly where they had always been. What the DNA dismantled was not a small claim. The idea that the Minoans were Europe's first great civilization in any meaningful biological sense no longer holds. They were a Near Eastern population on a European island. The cradle of European civilization, if such a phrase still means anything, sat on a foundation that had walked westward across the Aegean from Anatolia and the Levant during the Neolithic. The borrowing went the other way to what Evans had imagined. The Minoans did not give Europe its first sophisticated culture. They imported a sophisticated culture from the East and synthesized it into something new on Cretan soil. The originality of what they built is not in question. The pedigree Evans gave it is. What the DNA confirmed was equally important. The Minoan contribution to later Greek civilization was real, but it traveled by a different route than the textbooks claimed. Through the Mycenaean absorption of Minoan religious figures, through the unbroken continuity of populations on the island, through the threads that wove their way into the Greek pantheon, the Greek language, and the Greek literary tradition, the myth of King Minos, the labyrinth, the Minotaur. These were Greek memories of a civilization that had never quite gone away, refracted through 3,000 years of inherited story. Then there is Evans himself, a man who began excavating Knossos with a thesis already in mind, a man who reconstructed walls and frescoes and figurines according to his own Edwardian preconceptions about motherhood, kingship, and European civilization, a man whose famous priest-king fresco was assembled from the fragments of 3 separate figures because he had decided what the figure should look like before he found it. A man whose loss of his own mother at a young age, scholars have suggested, may have shaped his certainty that the Minoans worshipped a single dominant mother goddess. The Minoan story was bent, for 100 years, around the assumptions of the man who first dug them up. Ancient DNA has straightened it. The villagers of the Lassithae Plateau today live ordinary modern lives. They farm, they raise livestock, They work the same upland soil their ancestors have worked for 3,000 years. Most of them have no particular reason to think of themselves as the genetic heirs of the bull leapers and the snake goddess priestesses. But the science says they are. The bloodline that built Knossos is still walking. It has weathered the collapse of empires, the rise and fall of languages, the absorption of gods, the rewriting of history by foreign archaeologists, and it is still here, in the same villages, on the same plateau, above the same caves where the bones were buried that finally told the truth. The real mystery of the Minoans is not who they were or where they went. The real mystery is how a civilization could be standing in plain sight for 3,000 years and still be called lost. A civilization was claimed by Europe while its descendants walked a Mediterranean plateau. A people were called vanished while they farmed the same upland fields and lit candles in the same mountain caves their ancestors had used 3,000 years earlier. The Minoans were not Europe's first masterpiece. They were a Near Eastern population on a European island, building something original on a foundation imported from the East. And when their palaces fell and their language died and their gods were absorbed into a foreign pantheon, the people themselves did what people have always done when their world ends. They went to higher ground and waited it out. Ancient DNA did not rediscover the Minoans. It confirmed what the bones in the caves had been saying all along, except to the men who came later and decided the story needed an ending. The bloodline that built Knossos is still here. It never left.